But we have a bit of an impromptu space apparently here. It looks great, you know, people sort of settled in across all of these various steps and whatnot. Of course, there's this strange water in the middle. Feel free to swim in the midst of this. That's great. My name is J.D. Miningeriu. You feel free to call me J.D. if you wish, but I am a professor here at VDU. I teach literature, I teach philosophy, and I teach political theory. And I have been asked to speak with you a little bit this afternoon about liberal arts, or a liberal arts education, and what that means. I will tell you right up front, I don't think there's a single answer to this question, so I'm not going to sit and just overly define it for you. I will give you some definitions, but I think one of the wonderful things about a liberal arts education is that a liberal arts education is about questions. It's about questions for things we don't always have answers for, rather than the things that we can simply find answers to. I think that's what makes it a powerful education, if nothing else. So that's what I've been asked to speak about a little bit this afternoon. Among some of the questions that I think are central to something like a liberal arts education, I'd like to start with the following. Do you know what you want? No. I'm going to hear a lot of no's. I don't have a yes to that answer, only for the small and banal things like, do I want a beer right now in the sun? Yeah, that would be nice. But, you know, the big picture questions, you know, if you answer yes, do I know what I want in the big picture sort of spiritual sense? Okay, either you're lying or you have mastered psychoanalysis to the point of being a superego, a super special human. When within a university context we ask questions like, do you know what you want? For me, that is a synonym. It's a synonymous question for, do you know who you are? Right? In other words, if you know what you want, if you know where you're going, to some degree that says, I know who I am, or at least it says, I know who I kind of want to be. But as you'll see eventually where I'm going with some of this talk here, I think that's what liberal arts education is all about. It is not necessarily about finding a particular skill, although you will find them along the way. And it's not about sort of setting out ahead of time all of the basic models, frames, and roads for your life to take, and then just having to sort of wind through them. It's about finding them as you go along. So, you know, knowing what you want becomes a part of knowing who you are in that sense. But if we wanted just a simple definition of the liberal arts, and any of you can probably faster than I can define it, get on your phones and Google it quickly. You know, look, I can give you a quick answer and we can all be done here and go back to coffee and chatting. Liberal arts education, in a kind of boring sense, is a broad-based education in which you study various different disciplines in order that with that broader base you can be a stronger subject for society. You can be a better person in interacting with the rest of the world, along with getting a few key professional skills along the way. Simple enough. But that's an extremely boring definition. Doesn't tell us a lot necessarily, right? Let me give you a little backstory to this briefly before I turn around and tell you that this isn't actually what liberal arts is, okay? It comes from the Latin, it's from a Roman setting, okay, so it's got these great historical roots. We love to throw around the actual Latin phrases, artis liberales, right, as if that lends it a lot of gravitas and something deeply serious. But, you know, when they spoke about this in a Roman context, what they meant by liberal arts were basically these skills that you would gain in order to earn or in order to deserve the freedom that you have as a citizen. So it's skills that you had because you needed to, for instance, be able to speak in public and defend yourself. You needed to be rhetorically strong so that you could persuade people in court, for instance, because you had to defend yourself in a lot of instances. But it meant things like grammar and logic and rhetoric. Okay? On the other hand, it also meant mathematics. It meant some of the arts, probably music historically. And then to some degree it meant physics, or what today we would call physics, what then would be like astronomy or something. But that's the historical background to the whole thing. I mean, as we take it up into a modern context, the reason that we study that broad base isn't necessarily different. Obviously, we believe that, in providing people with a liberal arts education, they do contribute in a stronger way to a more open and democratic society, into an open and democratic process. But today we hear all kinds of hot key terms. I haven't looked, but I'm sure we can open up a VDU brochure, right? And we're going to see innovative, interdisciplinary, flexible, well-rounded. I always like the term well-rounded. Sounds like we're trying to make you all into like a ball, like you're all little kamoluke or little, basketballs, and we're trying to round you off. But no, I mean broad-minded, broadly trained. So we hear all of those terms, but the question, of course, is what does it really mean, right? What are you really learning in the process of this? And again, in a boring and simple sense, that means that you're taking courses and learning things and being exposed to ideas from the humanities, from the social sciences, from the natural sciences, or as some people strangely call them in the United States, the hard sciences, which I don't know why they would choose that word, but anyhow. At times it still means a classical education, meaning something grounded in the humanistic studies, something that involves classical languages and that kind of training. And okay, all of those definitions wrapped up together, yes, it does amount to something that we call a liberal arts education. But here's where I want to stop for a second, back up and tip the scales completely now. Because I think those are all fair definitions. And again, Google it, I'm sure that's what you'll find more or less in the information there. So liberal arts is all of these things, but yet in my opinion, there is something in defining the liberal arts in this way that runs entirely counter to what a liberal arts education is in fact at its core about. Right? In other words, that by standing here, me standing here in front of you and just lecturing in a kind of dry and uninteresting way about what the liberal arts is, if we define it, going back and giving you historical context, that's not really at the core of a liberal arts education. That's just feeding you information. And it is precisely the point that I want to make for the next couple of minutes, that a liberal arts education is something much more than feeding you mere information. Okay. So let me explain the paradox here as I understand it. I mean, the basic core of it is that a liberal arts education, if done right, if you explore it right, if you jump in with both feet, as they say, and really expose yourself to all of it, a liberal arts education will redefine, or at least differently define, knowledge. What knowledge is, what knowledge can be. Okay? And it redefines it not as static information, okay, but as something active, as something critical, as something transformative. And I'll back up to try to explain what I mean here a little bit. Static information, what a liberal arts education is not, at least according to me. If you want static information, you can take this thing out. You just want to know stuff about the world, use your phone and don't pay for a university education. It's all sitting right there. What would you need to go here for? You don't need to listen to me. Right? It's just all in this little thing. Or rather, it might not be in this particular phone. This is like the oldest version of iPhone. Like, I can't even download apps on this thing anymore. It's so out of date. But on a better piece of equipment here, you may in fact be able to have access to all of these things without any problem. Right? It's not static information. Again, I think you can get that anywhere. What so many employers seem to be, I'm going off my notes completely now, what so many employers seem to be looking for these days are, not already trained technical skills. They can give those to you. They can teach you what you need to know to do that particular job. They need people who are creative, who can communicate extremely well, and who can cooperate in teams and cooperate with other people. You put those three together, you be that person with a broad-based education, they'll teach you anything specifically you need to know, and you'll succeed wildly at this point in what is otherwise, we have to say, a reasonably difficult job market at this point. So, static information, what I hope, it's a part of any education, receiving a little bit of information, but I don't think it matters. What matters is knowing how to use what you look up, knowing how to use what an instructor puts in front of you on a slide. Memorizing a slide to regurgitate it on a test, it doesn't tell us very much. Again, I would argue that's not the core of what a liberal arts education is about. Rather, as we try to redefine or differently define knowledge as, like I was saying, active, as critical, as potentially transformative, I think what this means is that we head into the experience of learning, whether it's classroom setting, whether it's outside of the classroom, with an inherent sort of attitude of risk and of risk-taking. In other words, that rather than study something that is just about sort of, well, I know it's there, I just need to quickly acquire it, that static type of knowledge. Rather than that, it's risking not having any idea what this is like at the other end of it. And I would say even more profoundly, it's about risking yourself, your own identity in the process, right? That you don't know what will happen as you learn about this because, again, knowing what you want is about knowing and eventually finding out more about who you are. So I think, a liberal arts education in the best sense is totally transformative. Not in some radical way. I don't mean like you wake up one morning and you're Spider-Man or Spider-Woman, and you have secret powers. What you have are critical and reflective skills about yourself, at the very least. Right? And I think that goes a long way. And of course, in risking things, I think what you're risking is, just to be blunt and totally moral about it, I think you risk being a better person. Right? In other words, by becoming more critically minded, by becoming more self-reflective in the knowledge that you are gaining, you effectively become a better person to yourself, to others, and of course then, in that old sense, the big democratic open society type of sense. You better participate with others in a social and political process. So it comes down to a strange kind of thing that we hear philosophers tell us things like, all knowledge is self-knowledge, which of course at one level sounds ridiculous. Right? I know that there is water in here. Or at least I'm very sure that it's water. Not 100%. I could be drinking something very strange, but I'm pretty sure that it is. How is that self-knowledge? That's kind of what I want to try to illustrate for you now with an example before we're done. I wanted to show you a film clip. Obviously, I'm not going to show you a film clip anywhere here. But what I'll do is simply narrate this for you, because I think that'll work fine too. And this is an example of what I mean by sort of a critical knowledge, a self-reflective knowledge, a transformative or active knowledge. There's a film from the 1970s, so movie buffs, get ready for this. It's a film from the 1970s by the Italian modernist director Michelangelo Antonioni. I don't know if you know his work at all. I recommend it completely and highly. The film is called Professione Reporter. You might know it as, in English, if you know these films in English, you might know it as The Passenger. I have absolutely no idea why the name Professione Reporter would need to be remade into something else, as if we don't know what that would mean in English. Anyhow, that's a totally different matter. In this film, you have, this is a good one, Jack Nicholson. You have a young Jack Nicholson in this film, which is also very cool. But this is a film about a guy who is a reporter, and he works a kind of world political beat. We see him in Africa, in fairly remote locations, running down human interest stories that have some political and social value to people. Obviously, he seems to be working in these situations that put him in danger, and that also put him in, let's call them tense moral situations, where he sees whether it's genocide or human casualty, cruelty, etc. It seems that he experiences all of these things. And at the beginning of the film, we find this reporter extraordinarily disillusioned with his life, with the world around him. He seems like it's just baffling to him. He can't really handle it anymore. Why do people treat each other in this particular way? Why can't we figure things out a little better than we seem to have, etc., etc. All of these stories and all of these people seem to have worn on him a good deal. So there comes an interesting scene in this film about 2/3 of the way through, in which we get a little backstory on this reporter, and it comes in which we see a clip of one of his interviews. So it's an old, in the story it's a kind of flashback thing, but we're seeing his old footage from an interview. He's in a village somewhere in an unnamed spot in Africa, speaking to someone in the tribe that we're not exactly sure who he is. A chieftain of some sort, perhaps, a leader of some sort, perhaps, but he sits down and the camera at this point is on this sort of chieftain fellow who's sort of sitting over on one side. He sits on the other side, and the reporter, is the one with the camera. And so he begins the interview, and we see the chieftain sitting there, and we see then the reporter ask him some questions, or we hear the reporter ask him some questions. And the first question he sets up is, you know, I have heard from some here in the village that you were supposed to be a witch doctor here. And it seems very strange and unusual that someone like yourself, and I assume there he means someone who's supposed to be a witch doctor, someone like yourself was trained in France and in Yugoslavia. Right, so now that you've had that experience and you've come back here to take over this new role, don't you feel like it's a little, I don't know, wrong, a little immoral? You know, what you're doing here? Don't you have a better sense after this European Enlightenment? And it's just this great scene in which the guy just stares back at, right into the camera and looks at him for a moment, pauses very thoughtfully, and then he replies to him very carefully and very slowly, and he says, look, there are perfectly good answers to the questions that you're asking. And again, the chieftain sits and thinks for a little bit, and then he says, but, your questions say more about you than my answers would ever say about me. Right? And then again, they sit there for a little bit, and there's a little brief interchange in which the reporter says something like, well, I meant them very sincerely. And the guy's like, yeah, I'm sure you did. Right? And then he pauses for a moment, and then this guy gets up, and he comes over, he grabs the video camera from the reporter, comes over here, sits back down, and suddenly we see, because we're looking at this from the camera's eye, right, because it's footage, suddenly it's shot back onto that Jack Nicholson character, a guy named Locke, which, if there's any philosophers in the group, there's obviously a reference there to John Locke. But the character there is Locke, and suddenly we see him sitting there looking extremely uncomfortable, sort of under the gaze of the lens there. And the chieftain simply says, from sort of behind the camera, all right, now we can begin the interview again. So, ask me your questions. Ask me the same questions if you want. And then the footage cuts off and we end there. But I absolutely love the scene in this film. And there's kind of two parts to it. There's the part in which we learn a little bit about the context from the first question, and then there's that extraordinary move in which this supposed witch doctor takes the camera and flips it back on the reporter himself. Right, so let's look at the first part of this, the sort of initial section here first. He asks this question, and the question is he knows what he thinks, right, before he ever gets the answer. Right? The reporter is not asking a very honest question. He may feel he's asking something honest. He may feel sincere, right? But his frame of reference for asking this question is already set. He asks it from the perspective of a Westerner who has a particular set of values that are ingrained and finished, unquestioned, right? As in, this moral framework that I work with is unquestioned, period. Right? And the guy answering realizes that and just sort of says, look, why would I even bother answering? Because you're not really listening. Because with the point being here, at least from a critical perspective, if we are not self-reflectively, critically looking at the frame of reference of our own questions, and again, I mean this in the simplest sense, from the first moment you enter a classroom this week or next week, I hope it's by next week that you're in a classroom, you want to think about the frame of reference. What are the presuppositions of any of the questions? For instance, you're in Sociology 101, Intro to Sociology. You show up on the first day, you should be asking yourself, if not your instructor too, why are we doing this? Not just what does this concept mean? Because you've got to get the information, right? But you also always want to keep the big picture in mind. Why am I learning this? Why is this significant? What changes if I do learn it, if others would learn it? That kind of thing. Again, all extrapolated here just from that one moment in that film clip. But we still have that last part of the film clip to talk about, at least briefly. This moment in which the guy comes over, takes the camera, shines it right back on the reporter and says, now ask me your questions. Now we can have an interview, right? Because again, the questions we ask often say so much more about who we are and what we want, right, than the answers that we may eventually give. Precisely because I hope in a liberal arts context, the answers are not already given. We don't necessarily know the answers. We have to risk not knowing and asking real questions, right? So in a sense, that's the attitude I think that we all have to take as we enter into something like a liberal arts education, to make it more than merely broad-based education, right? And certainly something more than mere static information, static knowledge that we could just find on our phones if we needed to. So it is certainly my hope that whether you are here for a semester or for 4 semesters or 8 semesters or 10, please finish by 10. I hope that's the attitude that we can have as your instructors, you know, to challenge you. And I hope you insist on that level of discourse as you bring yourself to the classroom as well. And I think it's a mutual thing, and I think it's very important. So that's what I have to say. I suppose we can entertain questions if you really want to, but you can also enjoy the sun. All of you are in the shade over here. Come to the sun. Come into the light. Are there questions? You mean you're asking how can a liberal arts type model survive in a place where so many people seem to be gravitating towards sort of technical university type models of education?
Well, because these students, they chose.
Absolutely they did, and I congratulate all of you for that, absolutely. I mean, it's, first of all, the very fact that you would choose this education already says something, which is that you are more than willing to take a certain kind of risk. And that, I mean, risk takers, and I mean that in absolutely the best sense of that word. But, you know, to the point of the question here, 2 things maybe. The first is that I do think that, generally speaking, especially as we become not just a Lithuanian society here, but a European one, and more probably a very global one, as we become more mobile, I mean, and again, you all know more about moving around than I do. I mean, I moved a very long way to live in Lithuania, but you know, seemingly everybody, if you haven't yourself done it, everybody has a brother or sister, cousin who lives in London, or many of them that live in London or Ireland or wherever else. Like, we're all moving around. That mobility is only going to increase. And again, I think that in so many respects, technical education has some immediate practical application for some people. But more and more and more, the skills that people need are these generic skills that you get by being a smart human being, not by being trained in other ways. So you get it by, again, communication, or good communication skills. You know, the ability to be creative, to push boundaries a little bit, and to be able to, you know, work within a group setting, within a team setting, you know, to be synergistic. There's one of those sexy keywords that we like to toss around, synergy. But that's one of the reasons that I think a liberal arts education will continue to be something that is of great importance to people. Leaders and leadership positions are taken up very largely by people who are broadly trained. That would be another very key point about this. You know, again, there's some safety in, you know, being technically trained. But there's also, I would say, on the backside of it, a great deal of danger that if the course of that profession changes, and many have with technological shifts, you're in a fairly precarious position then, because you are very narrowly and specifically trained, and that's that. I think about people, for instance, who work on, just take any old example, like the people who are airline mechanics. Okay? For many, many years, they had a job because they knew how certain kinds of engines worked, backwards and forwards, and they did it extremely well. But now, as more of it is digitized, as the need to know computers and computer functions became the key component of that kind of job, suddenly we have people very narrowly trained who used to be, at least with the old models, extraordinarily good at what they do, are suddenly just kind of hands in the air like, what am I doing? I don't know what to do. Because they don't have a training that's other than that. Right? And they're left kind of, I don't know where, in limbo in a sense, professionally. And it's very difficult for politicians to know how to handle it. How do we support those people who don't, who are obviously intelligent, capable people, but we're not sort of, I don't know if mistrained, but maybe anachronistically trained. I don't know how to put it. I think all of those are answers to why liberal arts education is still an important one and a significant one. And I sort of want to address the part of your question too that asks about this gravitation towards technical degrees, because we do see that in some respects, but I also think that that can be easily shifted. It can be easily changed on the basis of what we as educators are willing to offer and explain to you, the eager, fresh young minds. In other words, I think there's an easy message from a technological university, and I'm not putting down KTU over here. They have wonderful people, and they also serve a vital function in their own way as well. But again, if we know what our message is and we know the kinds of things that we're developing, and again, as I hope I spoke of a little bit, it's not that easy to define. The slogans become more like these sexy keywords that I was talking about that occasionally feel like they're hollow. And I think we as educators can definitely do a better job of giving more flesh and meaning to those key terms. Helping you to understand them and better understand them ourselves. Does that help answer it a little bit? Yeah?
Thanks.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Good luck this semester.